All right. Well, with those little housekeeping things under our belts, let's get started with the 2015 grant year and welcome all to this How to Manage Your LSTA grant. I'm Diane Baker, the LSTA coordinator here at the State Library and Archives. And we have this webinar. I have done it before, although it's probably been a couple of years, but this particular grant year, there is a lot going on from the federal level, especially with new regulations and even some new things coming in from our granting agency, the Institute of Museums and Library Services. And then we'll be going over some regular aspects of getting underway with your grant. So with that, let's get started. And first order of business is congratulations to all of you. You have navigated the grant application process, gotten through the review from our State Council on Libraries and Literacy and here at the State Library, and you are going to be getting underway with a federal LSTA grant. Now, there are aspects, as I mentioned, this is a federal grant, so the stars in your eyes will come to, oh yes, there is a project actually to do. So that's what we're looking at today, to make sure you do have all the tools you need to get started and to do a successful project. So our agenda for today, we'll go over the grant timeline, some new requirements. As I mentioned, some things are coming from the federal regulation side, Office of Management and Budget, some new things from the Institute of Museums and Library Services. We'll talk about requesting funds for your project, reports that you'll need to be looking to do, if there's ways to modify a grant and what the parameters are for that, record keeping, an important aspect, and contact information, how to get in touch here and get questions asked or get clarification. So with the grant timeline, this is just a general overview of what we're looking at. The grant begins the soonest that if you got your information, we're looking for grants to start anywhere between April and July. It was a good year. The Congress did actually sign and get their budget done before the first of the year, which is only 3 months late for them, and that's pretty good. Sometimes we've gone well into March and April when they've had some budget battles. So this is a good year for getting a few extra months, getting started with the grant project. Mid-year evaluation, one of the other key parts, will be due in January 2016. The last day for grant expenditures, June 30, 2016, and your final evaluations will be due in October 2016. So a few more specifics on that. Some things you've already seen, and this is some of the new stuff that has come from the revision of regulations on the federal level. You've gotten an email award, announcement of your award, and information about the risk assessment. And the risk assessment has been turned in. So, and then after we had the risk assessment, we were able to get information as to whether we were low, medium, or high, and working with any of the you folks. And then you were able to receive your grant award documents, and those are coming in as we speak. As soon as you get a notification from me, that would be a copy of your signed grant and aid award with not only the signatures from your institution, but also from the State Library Administrator. You get a scanned copy of that, you are good to go and get started with your project. And you get that notification from me with an attachment of that scanned signed document. So at the latest, we're looking for grants to start July 2015. That gives you a full 12 months to complete your grant. And as I mentioned, this year it's possible to get started a little earlier, and we do have several extra months in this particular grant cycle. Your first quarterly reports for fiscal will be due in October, and they will continue on every quarter on that after that point. In January, as you saw before in the other graphic, we do have the 6-month self-evaluation that will be due. May 19th will be the last day for a grant revision, whether it's a fiscal grant revision or if you need to make some kind of change in the programmatic side. That will be your last day in order to get a revision in, and so we can get it authorized and in place before the grant wraps up. And June 30th is when the grants will wrap up, and this is over a year from now, June 30, 2016, and that's when all your grant expenditures should be complete. July 20, 2016, not quite a month later, that will be the last day to send in your final reimbursement request to close out your 2015 grant. And October 3rd, as you saw before, that will be the date your final evaluation reports are due. That will be both your program evaluation and your final fiscal that includes all your expenditures and the detail of your 10% match. Now, as I mentioned before, if you have any questions as we're going along, don't hesitate to pop something into that chat box so we can make sure and address what you have a question on. Okay, let's look at new requirements. And some of the new requirements for 2015, as I mentioned, you saw the risk assessment. We have you do a self-assessment that adds in some information about your institution, about who is doing the grant project, and there was also a new requirement you've seen with that is information about your last audit, whether it was one of the single audits or a smaller audit. That was an additional piece that we have had this year. The grant aid, which many of you have already signed and sent in, you may not have noticed, but it has been revised. The main factor there is it used to be 2 pages, and because of some additional information that the revision in federal regulations has come up with, we had to add some additional items, and that is what has made the actual grant and aid award just a little bit over 2 pages. So it's now just about 2.5 pages with that additional information that's in there. That doesn't change anything. Most of what went in there that was required gave further detail about the award that the state library receives from the federal level. So it had more specific names for it. There were several other numbers that are identifiers from not only the CFDA, which is the Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance, the CFDA number, but there were all sorts of additional grant numbers that are used on the federal level that are now in a copy of what you have for your grant aid. There was an additional certification that was included, and this was on trafficking of persons. Came as a result initially of an executive order that was verified into regulation, and so you do see that additional item in the certifications. We did have that added into a bundle of certifications where you had one signature and there were some additional pages with regard to that particular certification. There will be a number of new reporting forms. The changes in the reporting forms that you will be seeing in 2015, a few things have come up as a result of the new regulations that went into place in December. Some also have come from changes that are occurring at our federal grant agency level at the Institute of Museums and Library Services. So there are 2 things that are driving some of the changes that you will see in this if you have been part of an LSTA grant program before. So we'll take a look at a few of those things as well. There are also new requirements for documenting salary, and we'll talk about that. This is not only if you are using LSTA funds to cover salary, but also if you are using your own personal time, I shouldn't say personal, your work time as a project manager to cover your LSTA match. So that will show up in a couple slides ahead. So I shouldn't say couple, it's right here. So the new reporting of salary, this does come out of the federal regulations. This is something we've learned to call the federal super circular. And it has been out there, if you guys are into any of the federal regs, this has been out in discussion and review for over a year. And the final versions of it came out just this last December. Part of the whole program was to have uniform reporting requirements for all grants, because there are many, many granting programs across multiple agencies and institutes. Even though there were federal regs, there were still additional things that were going on in different programs. And this was an effort to try to unify the requirements for all programs across the board. This, although there have been requirements at the OMB level, or Code of Federal Regulations level for salary, they did change some of it. So you will be seeing some forms with regard to that. So basically, what they're saying now is, and it has been true before, that you did have to prove ultimately your costs, but they would accept a range of things that they will now no longer accept. So you do have to have actual costs. It cannot be estimates of your time as in kind. It cannot be estimates of the time that is done under LSTA funds for salary. It has to be verifiable. You have to be able to show dates, hours, and tasks that are tied to your grant project or tied to the individual in kind and how that relates to the grant project. So as I mentioned, grant funds, matching funds. You do not have to use any particular form, but you may use, if you have a local system where this can be recorded, you can use that with internal controls. It still has to be able to go back and be verified as to dates, hours, and tasks. So that's where it has to show back to most of you. If you are looking at had looked for LSTA funds, you did submit a job description or some very specific requirements that were going to be handled by an individual, whether on contract or salary ultimately. But with salary, you do need to have that amount of information, and it can come from your local system. That's one of the areas they say is of great flexibility. They do not have a list of things in regulation that's, oh, you need to have this, oh, you need to have that, or an example. They have left it flexible, which is really nice in some ways, and leaves a lot of us with questions as to what's going to be past audit. Now I see a question here from Joan that if you are recruiting performers for the project, which this is, if I recall, this is for your international program that you're doing, do you count if you're recruiting? And it really needs to start in April. I believe I have all your forms for you guys in Henderson, and you should be getting your notification back. So essentially anything from probably this week on, you can count as in kind. Now I will have, and let me jump forward here. So you can see this is an optional form. It will be up on the website later this afternoon. Same with the reimbursement form. I know the reimbursement form is actually already up there. So this one will be there under the 2015. This is an example of what we expect should pass audit for this level. If there's a program audit or if you have a federal audit of record, this is what should cover you. And you see where you do have an employee, you have a beginning and ending date, the different job duties that you will have done for, have the individual do. This can work for the individual that's doing the in-kind as well. And you identify the task, you indicate what day of the week, um, and total hours, and then what the hourly rate is. And you can, in the hourly, there's an option for it. It can be just the base rate, it can be hourly and benefits, whatever works on that part that you can verify. As I said, this is an optional form. They have given us a framework in the regulations, but they have not given specifics. So as I said, there's flexibility where if your internal system, especially if you're putting someone on salary in your system, if your internal controls will give you the information that meet the requirements we've been talking about, you should be fine using internal and not have to use a separate reporting form. If this causes any questions or concerns, and I do expect, I mean, we're working through it on the federal level as well, because we do provide, there's matching that the state has to do for the federal award. We don't use much in salary, but that most of that actually ends up for us in maintenance of effort, but we have to be prepared for the same thing as well. Okay, I see potentially another question coming in, and oh yes, what Stephen Harris has mentioned is that the in-kind part is the difficult aspect, and that's true. We have allowed and been able to allow a little less stringent requirements in the past. With these new regulations, that part of the flexibility is gone, and so having it there and verifiable. And part of that is that the 10% required match, if you put in more than 10%, that's fine for general reporting. What we do use the required 10% match as part of the matching for the federal program, because the match for our LSTA award can include state and local. So that's why we get into things needing to be verifiable. And besides that, even with the state audit, not even on a federal level, which a state audit can come and take a look at these programs as well, they would be looking at the same type of information we have on. So keep this, as I said, this particular optional form will be up on the website later today. And as you are getting underway or looking for things, you can definitely give me a call, send me an email, because there is a lot going on with this part of the regulations, with salary and verifying, and many other parts that are coming up as well. All right, let's go on. Another new form, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we get on to requesting funds. But those of you who have been in the program before, our reporting form or request form for reimbursement has been completely different. It is now completely and only available in Excel. It had been done in Word, and we had it in Excel also, but now it will be exclusively in Excel. And this will provide a mechanism for you not only to do your grant reimbursements, but also to identify your matching funds. Some of what you see here is actually being driven by new reporting requirements we are going to have to our federal agency, the Institute of Museums and Library Services. In the past, when we've reported on completed grants, we've reported the completed or the total amount of federal funds, LSTA, as a lump sum, and any matching funds as a lump sum in the reporting software that we have. What we are going to, we will be having new reporting software, and the costs will be broken down by the budget category. That will be how it will be reported to the feds. So what you're seeing here, and I'll talk about it more, we will be adding additional things and detail to the grant reimbursement request. So, since we're talking about requesting funds, let's get into it. So, it is, as I've mentioned, and if you're new to the program, this is a reimbursement-based grant. So you would request after you have expended forms, and you can request, or expended funds, and you can request on a form immediately after you have made an expenditure and completed and send money off for an invoice. So you don't have to wait around generally. We do ask that you, if you have a regular program that has routine costs, to request monthly, up to monthly. You don't, if there's a reason that you might need to request a little more often, or sometimes it does happen when we're getting close to the end of the fiscal year, there's a little less give in our different budget categories. Sometimes, can't cover costs, expenses that are going out. There's a potential to request a little more often. Just shoot me an email, get in touch with me, and we can make that work out for you. Now, one of the things, most of us don't have a problem with this, but funds that you get for LSTA may not be put in an interest-bearing account. And that can be with your treasurer's office, if you're on a county level. Most institutions that deal with federal funds are aware that this is not just LSTA. In general, federal funds may not be put in an interest-bearing account while you're waiting to reimburse yourself, even for a day. And sometimes, I know many large institutions, including the state of Nevada, even if they have money in an interest-bearing account that's coming in, it may only be in that account for a day or two before it's moved out, but it can make a fair amount of interest, and many institutions do count on that. But that is not an option with these funds. Now, if you might be projecting unspent funds or some other changes, as you're getting through the grant, this is looking forward a bit, give me a shout. You need the same with that other date in May 2016. If you know you're going to have some unspent funds or not sure if you're going to make it with some things by the end of the grant period, give me a call anywhere through. And you don't have to wait until May if you already know this is on board. So requesting funds, so new reimbursement form. Expenditures must be listed by budget category. And I touched on that when we first looked at the form. The 10% match also will ultimately end up on one of your forms. That can be held until the end. If you are going to be assembling things, many have this particular approach of breaking out funds, including match, has shown up in several other agencies. And as I mentioned, they're going for uniformity with all the grant reporting. Some institutions do it as a lump at the end when I've gone out to look to see what's been done with other groups, and some like to have it as it occurs, so it totals by the end and you can see where you're at as you're going along. That is an institutional decision, so you can go whichever way works best for you folks. So let's take another look at the form. Most of the information that you have here is pretty straightforward, not that much different on the top half. The look of it's different, but what we're asking for is pretty much the same. Just need the information on who you are, what library, your grant number, who our contact person is, who's submitting, and who's authorizing. So pretty straightforward on that. We have the information just across on your right-hand side on where to mail it in. At this point, our documents still do need a wet signature. That is something, if there is something, we're working on different approaches to deal with that with reimbursement. So if a change occurs during the grant year where things can be sent in as PDFs, we will certainly alert you and your fiscal staff as to when that takes place. Now scan down a little bit to the table below. You see across the table where the budget category, is listed, and this matches up to your budget categories that are in your application. So you'll list your budget category, you'll list the vendor or who is actually getting paid, your payee, what the product or service is, and that probably will match up to what you've listed in your budget narrative. But if you have a specific vendor, this is where your specific vendor name goes in the other column. This goes into the description of the service, the item, whatever you are getting from your particular vendor. You'll need an invoice number, and you can see here just in the example that there are several different ways invoice numbers show up, and we do know that vendors can be all over the map on how this could look. Sometimes the invoice number is listed in the first one as the date, or then there could be a unique number to the invoice. And as you look across, you see the amount to reimburse. Would be your federal funds, and you can see the list of things there. And then we also have there's a new column, amount to match. What you're seeing in that first line, and there are a few places that do that, they look to cost share or to pay for part of an invoice as their match. So part of the invoice is being paid by federal funds, and then they've opted to show part of their match. They are going to pay $300 worth of that particular invoice to satisfy the match, the LSTA match. And scanning down, pretty much the other four, we have another category, a couple library materials. They're looking to, in this particular library, they are looking to get 100% of those particular invoices covered with LSTA funds. And if you look at the bottom below the column of amount to reimburse, you see a total there. This form does have the calculations in it, the equations, so it will total for you. Then that last item there is something that is strictly LSTA match, and that's where the salary of the project manager, and you normally put the person's name in there, but we just put project manager, and they had 1.5 hours during the time frame that's covered by this reimbursement request. The invoice number, it's just the LSTA. They've opted to use that optional timesheet. They'll use that LSTA timesheet, and that's the dollar amount for the 1.5 hours that was recorded at this time. So this is tallying up the required match, so you have a running record of where it goes. And Kathy Brinkerhoff asked if it matters where the match funds come from. So like from the Friends of the Library, or if you have a donation, some places you might get a donation from an organization, or you may actually have an official partner on your grant and they are paying part of it. The source of the funds does not matter. So if you are putting in, and let's say you decide, for some agencies or institutions, it's a little hard to split out one invoice. So instead of that, they will have one invoice that's 100% LSTA, and then potentially they'd go down to our second one there under other. The $80 invoice might be paid from your Friends of the Library or from your partner, and that would just show a match on that part. So it would be listed. You have it listed that this was your other, and this was part of your LSTA match, and so the $80 would only show in the amount to match. But the source of the funds, it's not a problem. You just have to have a record like you would of anything else, that a record of showing that invoice and showing that it was paid. There's some other particular things that how that would be done within your locality. That again is an institutional decision, or you have some other institutional rules to decide on how that money is handled, whether it actually comes into your budget or if it's paid in a different budget. You just need to have a trail to show where the money has come from and that it paid for a product related to your project. Thank you. Good question, Kathy. Okay, now some of your questions may, as you get into the grant year and maybe the first time you're sitting down, or your fiscal person and the first time they're sitting down to work on this, will come up with questions. We're expecting that. So if as you run into those things again, you'll have my contact information and be glad to help you work through this particular one. Okay, so most of this you've seen before, but my favorite reminder, there's a number of things that LSTA funds may not be used for. Alcoholic beverages, well, not a big surprise there. General advertising and PR, and I mentioned that it's general. It's you can use LSTA funds if you put them in your budget. They can be used to promote your project. But for general library promotions that, hey, we've got a great library here, come in and see us, here's our hours, we'd love to have you buy, that type of general advertising and PR is what is not allowed. Construction, remodeling, and the next one you see a term honorariums, which generally we use pretty loosely. Lots of times what we really mean are speaker fees, we will call honorariums. In the federal speak and in their definitions, an honorarium is given for, it can be given with no requirement of any work done. It's just, you get this as an honor. And that's, so if you have used the term honorarium in your grant application, especially when you've shown that you're going to get a speaker, you're going to get a presenter, and you're going to pay them, truly you're not paying them an honorarium from the federal point of view. So that's not, don't get concerned that you can't pay for speakers. You can pay for speakers. You can pay for presenters. Just honoraria is a specific term on the federal level and something that is not allowable. The other thing's pretty straightforward. No giveaways, no personal memberships or subscriptions. So you can't buy your ALA membership or something of that for yourself, even if it's important as a project manager. There's institutional things are allowed, but not personal. Okay, so let's move on. In our agenda, next is reports, and there are some changes there. But generally, why do we have all these reports? Just about every report that you do or have to do is so we are in compliance with federal regulations. I want to say there's hardly anything in what you get and have to fill out that is for state purposes only. Sometimes there might be an item or two on a form you're already doing, but just about everything you send in to us is because the feds, the Institute of Museums and Library Services, or federal regulations are requiring that information. So let's take a look. What are you going to be doing? We talked about the 6-month progress report. Some of these are going to look different. These are not on the web yet. The 6-month progress report will have a different look to it, and you will see that. I expect to have all these out in the next couple of months. Some of what I'm fine-tuning will be determined by a meeting I will be going to actually next week. I'll be in Washington, D.C. with all my other state counterparts that do LSTA, and some of these changes that are coming up in reports are being driven by the changes in reporting at the Institute of Museums and Library Services. So these should be out in the next couple of months. And that's the same with the final project evaluation, which will be due in October. Something that's a little different with our quarterly fiscal, there will be a requirement to have a fiscal report for every quarter, whether or not you have expended or drawn down funds. What we have done in the past is that as soon as you've made your first request for reimbursement, that triggers when you start getting or have to give us quarterly fiscal reports. With the new regulations, we do need to have a quarterly fiscal whether or not you have expended funds or whether you have drawn the funds to cover expenditures you've already made. So that's a slightly different thing that you'll see this time around. The risk assessment, there will be a potential for those that have gotten anything above a low risk assessment, and you were notified when back when we sent you the documents. You had a lot of attachments and documents for your grant and aid award and your certifications. At the bottom of the message, there was an indication of what your risk assessment was. Most of them are low. There's only a couple at this point that are medium. We don't have anything at high. But if you did get a medium risk assessment, you will have a few additional reports that we will be adding to the grant file and will be maintaining as we go along to meet the requirements of risk assessment that has come down from the federal level. Okay, so I'm still moving along. You guys have been good about making sure you have been chatting any questions that you've had as we've gone along. Let's take a look at the next category. Modify a grant, and can you do it, and what can you do? Well, there are some options to modify grants, and we do try to be reasonable because we know things change. Things happen when you're working on a grant. Sometimes costs can come in lower than you expect, and you end up with more money in a category, and you've really purchased everything you need in that category. What do? Sometimes things come in at additional cost, or maybe you don't have to even make an expenditure because your partners, you have a partner and they said, hey, wait a minute, we'll buy that, and you can use it for a match. So what do? If your budget change is more than 10% of any of the categories, so, and that is a pretty low level trigger. But so if you change, want to take money out of equipment because your cost of the equipment that you purchased came in lower, and you want to put it to the other category because now you're able to buy some more supplies, maybe even to support that piece of equipment. If you change either category, whether it is equipment or supplies, let's say you had no money in the other category, you're automatically changing that more than 10%. So any change of 10% will require a pre-approved budget revision. And we ask you to give us the justification. Sometimes it's as simple as what I just mentioned. Cost came in lower. We have additional expenses that are grant related that support the goals and the outcome of the grant, and we want to move that to another category. You'll give us that justification, the planned expenses that you're looking to change, and then we do also want to know, is that going to add programs? Are there going to be fewer programs, more items, fewer items, change in the evaluation things? We'll be looking for that. And then if there's any other changes, then you let me know. And Joan has asked if this applies to grant funds as well as in-kind expenses. The area of in-kind that we would be concerned with is that 10%. And if you have written your application with the basic, just the 10% match listed, then yes, it would. If you, and some of the grants, you list everything that you're going to be expending, so you're really overmatching, and that's not a problem. But if it's in the area that's an overmatch, it's not a concern for us. But if it affects what is going to be earmarked for the 10% required, it's potential we could just do that under that last bullet point there, that it's under 10% or relating to in-kind. You can send a memo that would become part of your official grant file, but you could send a memo to my attention. And you're thinking mainly of salary expenses estimates. Again, if we're in an area where you're going to look for, like you're trying to make sure you're making your 10% with in-kind, and maybe you haven't identified enough, you can update that information for the grant file. But if we're getting into the overmatch, then we're not as concerned about that. And Joan, I'd invite you to send me an email and we can go over the specifics of it too, to make sure that we cover what you have a concern on. Okay. Thank you, John. And then the last thing, if you have programmatic changes, this one you do contact me direct for something that will be, and again, sometimes things happen where you have personnel changes at the library, so something is going to change in how things roll out. Maybe something's changed with a partner that you have. They are going to do some additional things, or they're not able to do as much as expected. That will ultimately end up with information that has to go in the grant file, but depending on what that change is will determine the best way to get that information from you as the project manager and make sure it's reflected in the grant file. Okay, so the budget modification. What you see here is for a budget or a fiscal change in your grant. This form will also be up on the web later this afternoon. Hopefully no one will need to use it for a little while, since nothing much has changed, I expect, at this point. And you will see that you have the categories look just like they did on your application. And so you will go through whatever changes you are looking for, and this again is if it is 10% or more change in any category. You list your current approved budget, the revision, dollar amount revision that you're looking for, and whether it's plus 300, minus 300, and where that will show, and then your final revision of what the actual LSTA budget would look like upon approval of your budget request. You'll see below there is a place for explanation. It goes further than what you see here. There's also a second page, which is just like the budget narrative, where you would be able to put in expenses that if there were changes, things you want to add to it, or maybe you're changing a major category, a piece of equipment that you'd identified specifically in the application is no longer available and you're buying a different one for a different price, and that's what's triggered it. You will put that information in, also how that could affect the program if you're able to add additional programs or outputs, fewer outputs, or if it's going to change your evaluation in some way. Okay, so that grant form, it's very similar. We have this one available in 2014 as well. So this is very similar. This one hasn't changed remarkably. Okay, now we're moving on to record keeping. Really, record keeping is not new. This is just a reminder for the most part, and especially for those that are new to LSTA. LSTA, the Library Services and Technology Act, has a very unusual records retention requirement on the federal level. And it is tied to our 5-year plan. So that is what drives this very unusual date that you see there for the 2015 records required to be saved until December 31st, 2021. What you are likely going to be saving in your particular grant files will be your forms, your grant application, potentially your proposal, any award letter, communications, such as if you've made some budget revisions, if you've asked for clarification on budget, if you've sent in communication about making a budget change that's under 10%, that's the type that you'd have in there. For your expenditures and match invoices, receipts, purchase orders, copies of any of those salary forms that you would be using would also be the type of information you would maintain in your file. And items that you create with grant funds, are you creating brochures, any other actual hard copy materials, or it's the type of place that you've created information, electronic information on the web, that would be in your final report. And of course, your final report would be in your grant file as well, and the links to any electronic information would be found there, so that doesn't have to be duplicated. The other thing is a requirement if you have purchased equipment that has a single or unit value of $5,000 or more, and I work with you on this if you are in that category. There are some other requirements, inventory requirements related to that, and some of those I also maintain an inventory of that because of some federal regulations related to high-priced equipment. So this is not if you buy, 5 computers for $1,000 each or 5 tablets for $1,000 each. This is if the one item is $5,000 or more. Okay, so what I haven't mentioned is a lot of what we have already discussed is in that LSTA grant manual that went out to you with all the other documents, the signature documents. What you see on the one side is what our base page looks like. I did pull the specifics on records retention that is in the manual. And if you kind of scan down to, all those words, get down to the bottom few lines, you'll see where it says grant documents from the 2013 to 2017 federal grant year must be maintained through that magic date of December 31st, 2021. So if you're returning, you're not new to LSTA. If you've had grants in the previous couple of years, 2013 is the grant year that just finished out last fall. They sent in their final reports, and we finished our reporting to the federal level in December. So if you had 2013 or 2014, these also have that retention date of December 31st, 2021. What if you looking up, you see what the rationale is, but our authorization for LSTA as a state is that 5-year plan. So all documents, everything related to anything in that 5-year plan needs to be kept until 3 years after the end of the 5-year plan. So that's the peculiar part. If you have a grant at the early part of a 5-year plan, you are holding on to that document a lot longer than if you get a grant in the 2017 grant year. So that's just, again, if your records people, your fiscal or other folks have any questions about that, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. I can get them the chapter and verse of whatever they need from the federal level, because this is a federal requirement. It's not, again, something we dreamed up on our level here at the state. Okay, we're getting down to the end here, and we are getting close to that hour time frame. Contact information, as I mentioned, there's a lot of places I've said just give me a call if you have questions, especially as you're going along. Love to be able to jump on something on the early side so it doesn't become a problem or an issue. Some things just take more time and effort no matter when we get to them. But if we can address it on the early side, lots of times it makes it into a non-issue or a non-problem. You'll see the connection to the LSTA website that goes directly to LSTA, and this is what the page looks like. What you see when you're looking at the middle part of the text, you'll see that there's 3 federal grant years. Actually, that is just going to be updated where there are the 2013 grant year has finished. That's going to be dropping off. So there's usually at least 2 federal grant years that show up on the LSTA website, and up to 3 until we get a grant year closed out. So what does one of those look like? Here you're looking actually at the 2014 grant year, and you can see we have program application information. And if you look at the bottom half of the screen, you'll see where you have project forms and information. The grant manual for 2015 is already up, as is the reimbursement request form. You will see we will also put up additional forms that I mentioned. The budget revision request form will go up later today, as will that optional salary reporting form. So this is coming to almost the end. I have a landing page here for questions if you haven't asked them already. I would invite you to also, as I mentioned, there are a number of changes and you will see a few more as some of the forms come out. If you have any questions about this as you start to execute your program, think back to what we've talked about today and go, wait a minute, maybe this is different from when I've done it before, or this is my first time through. What does this really mean to what I'm trying to get done? Don't hesitate to get in touch with me so we can make sure you have the information you need to have a successful project. And my advice, keep calm and do the project. And I think that kind of gets me to the end. We're a few minutes before the hour. But if you want to stay on and ask a question or get in touch with me later, I'd welcome you to do that. And I'll tell you, bye for now.